City Council meeting for Tuesday, June 21st, 2022, longest day of the year, maybe the shortest meeting of the year. Probably not. Clerk, could you call the roll, please?
Mayor Robinson.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Neuenhouse.
Here.
Councilmember Barksdale.
Here.
Councilmember Lee.
Here.
Councilmember Robertson.
Present.
Councilmember Stokes.
Here.
And Councilmember Zahn.
Here.
Councilmember Lee, could you please lead us in the flag salute?
Peace, Vice.
Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
I move to approve the agenda.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. City Clerk, do we have anybody signed up for oral communications?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. This evening, there are 3 pre-registered speakers. And before I start calling names, I'll just notify the public that oral communications, as a reminder, is for a period of no more than 30 minutes. And speakers are allowed to speak for 3 minutes each, and 3 people are allowed to speak to either side of one particular topic. And with that, I will call our first speaker, who is Karen Morris.
Hello. It's been a while. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. Karen Morris, address on file, and I am here asking the council to be responsive and protective of the welfare of its citizens, not just the politically connected and/or activists. As you know, I have followed and studied the issue of the impact of homeless uses on surrounding neighborhoods and in surrounding cities for many years. There is a lot of naivete around this issue and refusal to be proactive and head off problems until they are impossible to ignore and extremely difficult to deal with. Seattle and other regional cities are instructive examples of this. Bellevue aims to be more pragmatic, proactive, and head off problems and forward-thinking about how we handle things. But on this issue, we are being pulled towards making the same mistakes others have. If we do, it is the surrounding residents who will suffer, not pushing those methods that haven't provided public safety elsewhere. Many believe that sites in Bellevue will be serving mainly East Side homeless, but that is not true. All such housing programs are administered by entities such as Plymouth Housing, etc., and there are participants in King County's Coordinated Entry for All system, which evaluates and determines who receives housing in King County. When facilities open up anywhere in the county, they will most likely be immediately filled up with the homeless overrunning services in Seattle and elsewhere in King County. They will likely end up with very few spots left for our local homeless. And since no one is time limited in the permanent housing, spots will not open up very frequently either. And if you want to know the impact this will have on both Bellevue residents and the residents and staff of these places, you only need to look at the history of incidents in Seattle at these places, which I have. I am also concerned that council members who should be objectively evaluating and listening to their own citizens are serving as public advocates for one political and activist viewpoint here. I refer to open attempts on a local political site to drum up support and comment to drown out the voices of other citizens with a different opinion. I support any and all methods and amendments to mitigate the possible public safety and quality of life issues that will arise here, as they have in Seattle, Portland, and elsewhere. I personally don't think the proposed amendments on tonight's agenda go far enough, and they represent a compromise already. Please don't defeat them or water them down even more, and they need to be required, not suggested. In my long experience, they will never happen otherwise. They often don't even happen when they're required without diligent enforcement. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you will do the right thing here.
Thank you, Ms.
Just as an example, the person who threw the elderly lady down the light rail stairs in Seattle numerous times and then went and stabbed somebody has committed crimes in Bellevue and is well known to the Bellevue police. So if you think what happens there can't happen here, you're wrong.
Thank you, Ms. Morris. The next speaker on the list is Betsy Hummer.
Good evening. Mayor Robinson, Deputy Mayor Neuenhouse, council members, I'm Betsy Hummer. My address is on file, and it is very different to be back in person. It's very nice. It's wonderful. I am here to urge you to adopt the amendments proposed by Councilmember Robertson to the permanent supportive housing. The vulnerable population that makes up people experiencing homelessness deserve the same accountability from providers that other vulnerable populations, such as children, seniors, and those with disabilities, receive. The few requirements proposed guarantee the permanent supportive housing participants of the same standards they receive at shelters. A security plan, standard operating procedures, code of conduct, and community outreach simply codify best practices that quality organizations such as Congregations for the Homeless and Mary's Place employ. These practices need to apply to every provider so the participants have a guarantee that they will receive care they have been promised and they will have recourse if not adhered to. These are simply the same successful requirements that you all so carefully crafted for the Homeless Services Uses Land Use Code with input from the entire community. I urge you to be equally careful with the permanent supportive housing and guarantee the same accountability you did with LUC 20.20.455. Thank you very much for your attention and for your service.
Thank you, Ms. Hummer. Can I clarify with you, Ms. Hummer? I do see you on the list twice. You had about a minute left. Were you intending to speak on two different topics?
No, it was a little confusing because it said oppose or for or against. And we encountered that with the shelter. We were for or against it. The permanent supportive housing is going to happen. We're all for it. Some people would like no requirements, and some people would like better requirements and better accountability.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. The final pre-registered speaker on the list is Alex Zimmerman.
Microphone working?
Yep.
Thank you very much. Sie heil, my dirty, damn Nazi fascist mob, bandita and psychopath. My name Alex Zimmerman, and I want to speak about something what is very interesting, what is happening right now. Yeah. First, thank you very much to give us speak 3 minutes. It's very unique because nobody give us. And I give you example right now what's happened today in King Country, and when chair Consul Banducci, King Country Consul Baiducci, you know what it means, she's before you. She, only 3 people speak, and she cut from 2 minutes to 1 minute. And she doing this systematically many times. I'm totally confused. Maybe she have a COVID before, you know what it means? Sitting home in heaven, or what is I call heaven, yeah, for 2 years, more than 2 years. Maybe she have a mental problem right now. Maybe she's a psychopath. Huh? Because I don't understand how 1 or 2 minutes can change everything. She not care about this. So we have new aristocrat right now. You know what it means? What is live in heaven? Yeah. Evil live in heaven. Thank you very much. Seattle happened right now too, because last Friday, mayor of Seattle office, you know what it means, talks so consul very stupid. It's in Seattle Times, officially. So we have a big problem right now with Democrat. We need to clean this freaking idiot totally, because it don't have sense for many years. Right now I want to speak about Amazon mafia, you know what it means, what is one bring to Bellevue, 25,000 people. Guys, in 97, I speak here when Microsoft come, and I talk, who's this freaking idiot who in small city like Bellevue open a factory with 50,000 people? They say destroy Bellevue totally. I know Bellevue for 35 years, I live almost 25. It's not a point. Guys, situation right now very simple. This mafia will bring 25,000, and this all 25,000 is a slave. Because who work for Amazon and Microsoft never will be voting for Republican, never will be happy. They're boring like a slave because many come from jungle, but it's okay, no problem about this. But you never stop in Amazon. We have right now traffic, what is crazy. Months ago, from Bellevue Mall, you know what this means, to Factoria, I drive for 45 minutes. Guys, you make right now from Bellevue worst scenario of what is this in New York, this very expensive place, Manhattan. Guys, you make idiotic situation and you quiet for 30 years. I never hear from you, so somebody told you, this mafia need be stopped. Stand up, America. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of our pre-registered list. If there is anyone joining us here in council chambers who would like to make comment to the council, please raise your hand. Also at home, if you use *9 and use the raise hand function, please, to indicate you would like to speak. I do see one speaker here. Go ahead and come up, sir. If you can state your name for the record.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for accommodating me as well. I was late to signing up. So my name is Chad Vaculin, and I am representing the East Side Affordable Housing Coalition today. And the coalition is a group comprised of over 34 organizations that represent housing providers and direct service providers, faith leaders, community members, folks that are really going to be impacted and are pretty big stakeholders with this LUCA. And we'll also be working directly with the impacted community who will be subsequently living in this type of housing. And I really want to structure this conversation through an equitable lens, because we know that the people that are most impacted by housing insecurity and homelessness are members from different communities that represent LGBTQ plus community, communities of color, people with disabilities, seniors, veterans, and I really want to ground this conversation in that, because those are the people that are going to be at the end of the day most impacted by your decisions. So I really would like to applaud the Planning Commission for their diligence in the work that they've done this far, and especially through the robust community engagement work that they've done. And we know for the city of Bellevue to achieve its housing goals and meet the needs that our community members face, it's really imperative that all types of housing are really easily accessible. And the coalition strongly supports the allowance of permanent supportive housing and transitional housing in all land use districts where residential dwellings or hotels are allowed, as well as the allowance of emergency housing and shelters in all land use districts where hotels are allowed. And while this LUCA intends to expand access to housing stability, we are a little bit concerned that adding additional barriers to accessing of this housing, it hinders the goal and may run counter to the intent of state law, which kind of started this whole kind of conversation with the LUCA thus far. So we do want to thank you for your ongoing work to ensure that Bellevue can provide the full range of housing options to residents experiencing homelessness and housing stability. And we are definitely looking forward to partner and to further dialogue on how an effectively structured LUCA can improve Bellevue's comprehensive approach to the ongoing housing crisis, and while also at the same time reaching compliance with state law. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Merkelin. That I do not see any additional, or did not see any additional hands here or online. So Mayor, that would close oral communications.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have the report of our city manager, Mr. Miyake.
Good evening, Mayor and council members. I have one item under the city manager's report this evening, and that is a brief report from the Bellevue Parks Department as well as the Bellevue Downtown Association about the upcoming Family Fourth celebration. Joining us this evening is Jared Gilmore, who is a supervisor in our Parks and Community Services Department, as well as Mike Agliori, Vice President of Events and Operations from the Bellevue Downtown Association. With that, I'll hand it over to them for a brief report.
Hi, sorry. My name is Jara Gilmore, and I was recently hired as the program manager for the Northwest Arts Center and lead planner of the Bellevue 4th of July event, which is happening in just 13 days. And myself and Mike here are here to invite you to attend this event. We're very excited to bring it back in its full fashion this year. And we have a few pictures to encourage you with some colorful photos as Mike here introduces himself and explains the event in a few more details.
Yes, thank you, Jara. Council, we're very excited. The Bellevue Downtown Association is to partner with Bellevue Parks and Community Services and a number of other
Sorry,
departments.
I'm going to stop you for 1 second, not you.
Absolutely.
Our monitors are off.
Again, the BD is very excited to partner up with Bellevue Parks and Community Services and a number of other departments to make this event happen. It's the largest 4th of July celebration on the east side. Last year was unique. We turned and pivoted and made a fireworks display happen late in the game, thanks to a number of folks jumping in very quick. We were basically the only show in town. So we had large crowds, capacity issues, and we made it work, and kudos to transportation and police for making it work. We think it's not going to be as bad this year. All those other events are coming back, Seafair, Everett, Tacoma. I know Kirkland and Google are doing a drone show this year, so we're going to keep our eyes on that to see how that goes. But thanks to the Bellevue Collection again for being a host for the fireworks launch zone, as well as complimentary public parking at all of their properties. We're really trying to message out, it's not just Bellevue Square. If you're willing to walk or transport yourself another block or two, you're going to save a lot of time upon exit. We are, again, with last year in mind, shifting and trying to allow for more public viewing area. So we are downsizing our main stage, and we're going to put an entertainment plaza down near the pond. So we're going to open up that whole footprint. The family fun zone that's usually been in the southeast corner has been shrunk, and it's going to be more kind of on the east corridor there. So again, more public viewing spots for folks to settle in. Start time for the event is 5 p.m., and that is also when public parking is available at the Bellevue Collection properties. We've got Highland Middle School coming in with their choir to do the national anthem, and the Bellevue Youth Symphony Orchestra is back for live performance in that entertainment plaza. So really a great way to showcase all the wonderful things going on in the community, and look forward to having you all on site. So thank you.
I hope you get to see the pictures later.
Yes. Well, we're going to need them for other presentations too, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, Councilmember Stokes, I believe you have a recommendation for the Arts Commission. Would you like to introduce?
Yes, that's correct, Mayor. Very pleased to propose the appointment of Erica Inomoto to the Arts Commission. She's from Honolulu. She was in Seattle and been in Bellevue. She's a program manager with Microsoft. She has a master's in arts history and also in information management. She's worked for several renowned arts institutions, both in Hawaii and here. And she's currently serving with BAM as a member. And she's has just a great outlook on a role of parks and community service and culture, community service as well, in the city. And she'll be an excellent member of the commission. Really pleased to have her to recommend.
Would you like to make a motion?
Yes, make the motion to appoint Erica Inomoto to the Arts Commission position.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, welcome, Erica. Do I have a motion to approve the consent
I
calendar?
move to approve the consent calendar.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, we have 2 study session items. Mr. Miyake, would you like to introduce the first one?
Absolutely, Mayor. The first topic on your agenda this evening are the land use code amendments to establish regulations for permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, emergency housing, and emergency sheltering required as a result of the amendments in state law which occurred back in 2021. This topic was last in front of council at your May 23rd study session where the Planning Commission recommended a number of land use code amendments to the council. At that meeting, council requested additional information, as well as since then, there's been a number of amendments that have come forward to the Planning Commission recommendation. Tonight, staff are seeking direction on a land use code amendment to bring forward for adoption at a future meeting. Joining us this evening is Les Stead, interim co-director, Trisna Tanis, consulting attorney, and Nick Whipple, code and policy and planning manager, all from the Development Services Department. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Liz.
Thank you, City Manager. And good evening, council members, Mayor Robinson, Deputy Mayor Neuenhuis, and council members. Thank you for having us here tonight. We're looking forward to being back from our previous first study session on the permanent supportive housing amendments and emergency code. This is around allowing and regulating permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, and non-transient emergency housing. This LUCA will replace an interim official control that council first approved in July of 2021 and was extended in January. And has been, the one extension did apply and is actually ending in July. So we will be trying to either pass code prior to that or extend the IOC one more time.
Liz, I'm going to stop you for just 1 second because I realize we still don't have any visuals here.
So IT is working on that currently, but I've sent Dana to do a printout for all of you so
There
that
you go.
you can have those to follow along.
Okay.
It is in the desk packet if you want to access it, yes.
Everybody have the ability to pull that up?
No, I didn't bring it.
Okay. So it shouldn't take long. Let's just pause for a minute and
Sure.
get that. And it's up for the community, so. We'll continue. Thank you so much. Conrad, I'm calling the meeting to order.
Okay, are we ready?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And glad you can all see our presentation now. That will make it just a little bit easier in what's already a tough topic. So moving forward, I did want to go through what the direction is. We are looking for direction from council to bring the LUCA ordinance back for final action at a future meeting. Our agenda tonight will provide council with further background info about the LUCA and also various policy tools that are available to the council to further influence permanent supportive housing projects. Staff is also going to provide responses to questions that were asked by council on our first study session, which was May 23rd. And we will also provide more info about the outreach and engagement that has occurred on this topic. And then lastly, we'll discuss next steps moving forward to process this LUCA. I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Tristan Tanis, our consulting attorney, who will go through the rest of the next portion of the slide deck.
Great. Thank you, Liz. Good evening, Mayor Robinson, Deputy Mayor Newhouse, council members. I realize that this is somewhat repeat information, but we did want to provide a little bit more information about the genesis of the LUCA. The state legislature did pass House Bill 1220, and it added an RCW 35A 21430, which requires cities to allow permanent supportive housing, transitional housing in all land use districts where residential and hotel uses are allowed, as well as emergency housing and emergency shelters where in all land use districts where hotels are allowed. Portions of this legislation became effective last July, and Council adopted an interim official control to quickly bring the city's regulations into conformance. The IOC was subsequently extended, and it is now set to expire on July 12th. If this LUCA is adopted by Council and is effective before this expiration date, it will repeal and replace the IOC. As Ms. Stead mentioned, we do want to talk about the policy tools that are available to Council. The first is the Land Use Code. This is, of course, the subject of tonight's meeting, and we are looking to amend this Land Use Code to establish regulations for supportive housing, transitional housing, emergency housing, and emergency shelter. And the Land Use Code will contain the regulations for these uses, as well as the requirements for citing the uses and the development standards for these uses. For supportive housing, transitional housing, emergency housing, and emergency shelters, the applicable provisions do have to comply with that RCW that I stated earlier. The second policy tool is the work that Council directed in the best practices guide. The guide was to collate together best practices and tools for community outreach and engagement. The guide would also provide an overview of city resources that can help with this engagement, and these practices can really be tailored to the specific project that is being contemplated. The third policy tool is Council decisions relative to funding agreements. The city does provide funding to support development of housing. In these agreements, Council can decide on what agreements and covenants should be in place for the, including income restrictions, submission of certain documents such as budgets and schedules, conditions to acquire the property, as well as to repair or rehabilitate that property, and other items. All of these would, of course, be specific to the project that is being funded. So all three of these policy tools may be considered at the same time and in parallel. So I know there's a bit of sometimes confusion as to which decisions are influencing what. This slide shows those meetings that correspond to the Land Use Code amendment that is being processed in front of you now. From the IOC, the first IOC adoption on July 12th of last year, the public hearing on August 2nd, and then the Planning Commission processing of the LUCA, which started at the first meeting on September 8th until April 27th, when they made the recommendation decision. And Council began considering this LUCA, of course, on May 23rd, and this is the second study session.
Tristan, will you guys tell us what slide you're on?
Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
Forward? That's okay. That was 5.
That was slide 6. Now
that
we are
was
on
6?
slide 7.
Oh, okay, well,
My
that's not going
apologies.
to work. It's not consistent with our packet, so never
Yes.
mind. We can just look at the screen.
Slide 7.
Okay, good thing. Okay, good thing we're doing it this way.
So slide 7, best practice context, is the title of the slide. So for this work item, Council discussion really started in earnest on July 26th of last year.
when the work program around impact mitigation for permanent supportive housing was introduced. The discussion was to consider opportunities to create a set of conditions that would ensure that future owners and operators of supportive housing do so in a manner that's integrated to the community and includes conditions that benefit the residents. These conditions included property maintenance standards requiring on-site supportive services, minimum ratio of staff or caregivers to residents, a safety and security plan, and neighborhood outreach and engagement. On August 2nd of last year, Council discussed these conditions under the heading Work Program around Supportive Housing and Best Practices, and decided to direct staff to look at two areas, on-site services and neighborhood outreach and engagement, as potential regulations or best practices work. And on November 22nd, and forgive me, there's an error in the slide, it says January 24th, but it's actually November 22nd. Staff returned and recommended that any on-site services requirements be part of funding agreements, and so that they can really be tailored to the projects at hand. And the city should work on neighborhood outreach and engagement as a best practices guide. So after discussion on this November 22nd meeting, Council affirmed staff's recommendation, and in fact, the best practices guide is being worked on now and is nearing completion. So going to the next slide, slide 8, funding agreement context. In the funding agreements context, Council also has the opportunity to make policy decisions to fund projects, and these are some examples of these projects. The Elahi Apartments, Plymouth Permanent Supportive Housing, and the CFH Eastgate was decided on July 12th of last year. And then for LifeWire and Hope Starts Here, or HSH projects, on January 24th. These funding agreements, as I mentioned earlier, do include provisions for income restrictions, conditions to acquire the property and what repairs would be necessary, as well as submissions of the budget, schedule, inspections, and monitoring reports. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick Whipple to explain the components of the Planning Commission recommended LUCA and provide answers to the questions asked during the first study session.
Great, thank you, and good evening, Mayor Robinson, Deputy Mayor Noonhouse, Council. As Trisna mentioned, the land use code that's before you this evening is recommended by the Planning Commission, and there are really two uses that are addressed through this LUCA. And the first being supportive housing. So one of the primary organizers of the uses described in state law and addressed in this land use code amendment relate to the duration of stay. So the uses where the length of stay is 30 days or longer, they have been categorized as supportive housing. And supportive housing is proposed to be regulated consistent with the historic regulatory scheme of treating supportive housing as a residential use, as this use does provide more stable, long-term, or non-transient housing, as compared to homeless service uses, for example, which have a different impact. So the LUCA establishes supportive housing as a separate and distinct use. Supportive housing is allowed consistent with state law in all districts where residential and hotel uses are allowed. One of the requirements added to the LUCA related to supportive housing is a requirement for on-site kitchens. This requirement is flexible in nature in that it does allow for different arrangements to occur, whether that be a kitchen in the unit or a common kitchen in the building. The purpose there, of course, is to ensure that residents do have access to a meal prep area or are able to have meals on site, since supportive housing is housing. And then there are also two design controls in the recommended LUCA. These relate to locations in single-family land use districts. So the first being that the supportive housing location must maintain residential character. This is consistent with other sections of our code where we have home occupations, for example, in neighborhoods, just to avoid redevelopment of a single-family home in a way that would put like a major lobby or something, in the front, something that would make it look slightly different than a typical single-family residence. And there's also a requirement in the single-family land use district that on-site services are provided for residents only. This is to limit the activity of people not residing in the area coming to the single-family home for services, support services. There's also a registration requirement in the recommended LUCA. This registration requirement would apply to sites that have more than 25% of the floor area devoted to support services or supportive services. So the registration would require a safety and security plan, a code of conduct, and a standard operating procedure plan. There is also a mailed notice that's sent within a 500-foot radius of that supportive housing location. Again, this registration would only apply to those locations that have supportive services that are greater than 25% of the floor area of that location. And then moving on to the next slide, slide 10, homeless service uses. So the council did not direct changes to the homeless service use requirements in the land use code, so there are no changes to this section of the code. The way that the Planning Commission sorted the uses, again, was by the length of stay. And so where the length of stay is less than 30 days, that use has been categorized as a homeless service use. So of the uses addressed by state law, the draft or the recommended LUCA has categorized transient emergency housing and indoor emergency shelter as a homeless service use. And homeless service uses have now, the definition has been expanded, or the section rather has been expanded to include transient emergency housing and indoor emergency shelter as allowed uses where hotels and motels are allowed. And but there is no change to the permitting process or the path to allow for those uses. So the CUP or conditional use permit process is still in place, as well as the requirements in Land Use Code Section 20.20.455, which relate to homeless services uses. So those have not been changed. So moving on to slide 11, so to respond to some of the questions that we had heard at the May 23rd City Council study session, the first question being or asking why a conditional use permit for transient emergency housing is required. So as mentioned just in that last slide, transient emergency housing has been categorized as a homeless service use based on the duration of stay. And there have been no changes to the homeless service use requirements. So the state does not provide a distinction for emergency housing, transient versus non-transient, but that distinction was provided as a means of regulating intensity of use by acknowledging that emergency housing locations that have a length of stay that is less than 30 days are more akin to a homeless service use or a shelter. So the distinction between transient emergency housing and non-transient emergency housing fits within the framework of the land use code by regulating these housing types based on the impact associated with that duration of stay. So non-transient emergency housing under the proposed land use code is allowed in more locations than required by state law, and it would be treated as supportive housing. But the state does acknowledge the difference between emergency housing and supportive housing in that emergency housing is allowed in fewer places, that being only where hotel and motel are allowed. So with the next question of how the LUCA addresses intensity of use, again, it's really based on the duration of stay as well as the registration requirement. And so there are certain locations, supportive housing locations that fall under that exempt category, meaning that their area devoted to supportive services is less than 25% of the floor area. And so those are categorized as kind of the least intense uses. And then homeless service uses are more intense, and those have the full conditional use permit requirement with them. And then non-exempt supportive housing are those projects or locations that do provide supportive services that are more than 25% of the floor area. And so a registration requirement would be applicable to those, that subset of supportive housing locations. So with the next question about can a lease agreement satisfy the code of conduct? So a code of conduct is, again, required for those non-exempt supportive housing locations. We did have a chance, both CFH and Plymouth were able to provide some draft lease agreements so we could take a look at those and understand what's typically included within those. It does appear, based on that review, that the lease agreements do cover a lot of the same subject matter that a code of conduct would cover. And so it does seem as though the lease agreement could be used as a starting point or a starting place when crafting that code of conduct, which would be required for non-exempt supportive housing locations. And so moving on to the public engagement. So for this land use code amendment, we did complete 3 modes of outreach. So the standard process for requirements of the noticing as well as the public hearing did apply to this project. There was also dialogue between service providers and supportive housing operators, as well as staff and human services that are familiar with these housing types. So we did discuss the land use code amendment and some of the requirements associated with that. And then the city also had an online presence. So a web page was launched. That web page was kept up to date. And people were able to provide written comments to staff contacts. And then we also updated it to just mark the progression of this LUCA as it moved through the Planning Commission, the East Bellevue Community Council, and then now through City Council. So on to slide 15, the LUCA process and schedule. So this was the process that was taken for this LUCA leading up to tonight, which is Council's, again, second study session on this LUCA. The Planning Commission did have thoughtful discussion on this LUCA over 5 study sessions and a public hearing as well. There were 3 study sessions that led up to the April 27th public hearing, 3 study sessions that led up to the February 9th public hearing. And then there were 2 study sessions held after the public hearing before recommending the LUCA to the City Council on May 23rd. May 23rd, the City Council reviewed the Planning Commission recommendation, and we are back tonight seeking council direction. And then just as a reminder, the interim official control is set to expire on July 12th. We also wanted to note that there will be opportunity for future policy conversations that are separate from this LUCA relating to supportive housing best practices. As Ms. Tanis mentioned, that work is wrapping up and is expected to be headed back to council. And then also when there are funding agreements for individual projects. So those future meeting opportunities are for further conversations to inform direction for best practices, as well as opportunities to inform funding agreements with individual projects. So just to end the slide or the presentation with the direction, we are seeking direction tonight for council to direct staff to bring back the LUCA ordinance for final action at a future meeting. And with that, we will turn it to you, Mayor.
Okay, thank you for that presentation. So I think we'll start off by making a motion. Deputy Mayor, if you could do that.
Certainly, Mayor. I move to direct staff to prepare the permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, emergency housing, and emergency shelter LUCA ordinance as proposed by the Planning Commission for final action at a future meeting.
Okay, thank you. So I will open the floor up for discussion and questions. I know that we have 2 potential amendments here, so I'd like to take one at a time. If there are any other amendments, we'll entertain those as well. But go start with Councilmember Robertson and let you propose your amendment.
Do you want me to walk through that instead of asking questions right now? I'll walk through it and I'll ask questions as needed to make my point, I guess, later. So, okay, so I know that you have some pocket slides, which I just saw, that should walk the council through the differences between mine, but I'll just go ahead and launch in. You're welcome to put those up. We have them here on our pages. So, as you all know, we've been at this topic a long time. We did the homeless citing Luca. We are now doing the permanent supportive housing Luca. And the ESSHB 1220, which does require all cities to allow these kinds of uses in hotel motel and the permanent supportive housing and transitional housing in every zone where residential is allowed, is not a blanket, you must do that with no right sizing or no local amendments. The bill specifically says that reasonable occupancy, spacing, and intensity of use requirements may be imposed on these types of housing to protect public health and safety. Any such requirements on occupancy, spacing, and intensity of use may not prevent the siting of a sufficient number of permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, indoor emergency housing, or indoor emergency shelters necessary to accommodate each code city's projected need for such housing and shelters under the GMA. So we have definitely been allowing these. I think that it's a good thing to be complying with state law, but I also think that we need to be thoughtful about using the authority that we're given under state law to make sure that these are regulated correctly. So to that end, I worked with staff. I really liked the Redmond code. They're ahead of us in the schedule, and they're an East Side city. They share a border, and they have a council much like ours. And I really liked their code. So I worked with staff to create the redlining. Now, just to orient you to attachment G, the purple red lines are the Planning Commission red lines. The red text is where I made changes. So walking you through, there's 6 kind of general topical changes. The first is to make the single-family uses consistent with the standards for adult family homes in Bellevue. Staff initially recommended limiting to, I think, 8 bedrooms for single-family zones, and Planning Commission took that out. The standards for adult family homes in Bellevue allows 8 residents plus staff. So in order to make sure that this is right-sized for single-family homes without telling them how many people to put in bedrooms, I thought the easiest thing to do in Bellevue is to make these single-family uses consistent with adult family homes, because this kind of is like that. Supportive housing requires staff and services in order to keep people healthy, housed, and doing well. So it's very much like an adult family home. So that's the first thematic change. The second is we created a separation of a half mile between these types of uses. That's straight from the Redmond Code. And this keeps the type of housing dispersed across the city, does not lead to an oversaturation in any one area where, for example, there might be less expensive land. So that, I think, is one of those things that makes this, it's the whole city's job to solve this, and this makes the whole city a place where it can be solved. Second, with regard to the security plan, outreach, and code of conduct and standard operating procedures, these were already required by the Planning Commission draft. What this does is this provides details as to what they are. So if you look at the draft in attachment G, it specifically will say security plan, but then it doesn't have a lot of detail about what that is, or code of conduct. There's no real standards of what the code of conduct is. It requires standard operating procedures. The one thing that's a little different is the operating agreement. Again, this is directly, and all these details are directly lifted out of the Redmond Code. So why remake it when you don't have to? So that just kind of puts meat on the bone and gives better direction for what those are and what they mean. I removed exceptions from general performance standards like density. They had some footnotes in the land use tables that would have allowed permanent supportive housing to be denser than is allowed for other housing in the underlying zone. I thought that they should be subject to the same general standards, so we took those footnotes out. Finally, for zones where large permanent supportive housing facilities may be located, it limits the number of residents to 100, just like our housing uses. unless additional mitigation is provided. And this, again, is straight from the Redmond Code. So these standards have been already adopted without a lot of issues in Redmond. I think they're balanced and consistent with the local authority granted under state law, and are much less stringent than what many other cities have been drafting. I think they're going to make this, allowing permanent supportive housing everywhere is kind of a bit of an experiment, and I think it's going to make the experiment more successful and predictable, and not just for the neighbors who might be worried about these going in, but for the people living in these facilities. We heard from CFH about how they were a little nervous about the process of siting the shelter, and it turned out really well because the people around there are they've gotten volunteers, people are accepting, they're excited about it. I think it's going to work much better. So I think it's going to create better connectivity and really better protection for the residents to make sure that they have support services on site, et cetera, et cetera. So I believe that the draft as amended in attachment G does strike the right balance, and I would encourage you to support the changes as the best balance for compromise. If we find out in a year or two's time that these standards do not allow, what's the language from the statute? They do not allow sufficient number of permanent supportive housing and transitional housing in Bellevue, which I highly doubt, we can change them. But in the meantime, I think that these are going to allow way more than we will ever need to serve the people who need these services, who live or are connected to the city of Bellevue. I would also point out that the operating agreement does prioritize people who either are homeless in Bellevue or who have ties to Bellevue, and that's something I've heard this council say many times is a priority. So I really tried to create a compromise that I thought the council could get behind that would make this better. Also, for those of you that weren't at all the Planning Commission meetings, and I was only at the ones since January, we received literally hundreds and hundreds of pages of comments from the public, either objecting to this altogether, which of course is something we cannot do, nor would we want to, but asking for more standards so that everyone can feel really good about these types of facilities. We have some great providers who may go through all these processes anyway, whether they're in the code or not. But that doesn't mean we're not going to have a provider that really needs the standards in the code in order to encourage or mandate that they actually do provide the service and these standards that are best for the residents, both in the facility and nearby. So I also think I would just add, finally, the operating agreement, I think, will not only make them better neighbors and better providers to the people in the facilities, I think they're going to create a really great cooperation and collaboration between the city and the providers, because between the police and the providers, between the city homeless outreach department and the providers. So I think it's going to really work a lot better if we make the changes that are in attachment G.
Can you propose a motion?
Sure. I'll move to amend to give the direction to amend the Planning Commission draft, and thank you for letting me take my time to walk through this. I make a motion to amend the Planning Commission draft to make the changes that are found in attachment G.
Second.
Okay, so now I'm going to open the floor to discussion and questions about this particular amendment by Councilmember Robertson. So Councilmember Zahn, you want to start us off?
Sure, Mayor. Wasn't quite prepared to be the first one to comment, but I can. What I was trying to understand as I look at these is that I know the Planning Commission spent a lot of time studying and looking and finding a balance for what we were trying to do and getting comments. So I wanted to understand what the impact is to these different provisions that are being proposed in the ability for these types of housing to be provided. So I know when we had our briefing, I had mentioned that it was something I was interested in understanding.
Thank you, Councilmember. When we think about it, there are some of these that certainly you could say would add more time, would add more process. So potentially there's more time and cost to the process, such as a conditional use permit or some of the requirements. There also would be some impacts to city staff. Some of those impacts would be requirements for the police department to be involved and health and human services groups. On the balance, I don't have a lot of specific. We have not done a deep dive analysis to determine how it would truly impact the provision of housing. We can certainly see some of the potential cost impacts, and we can certainly see some of the impacts to city staff. But beyond that, we do not have the specifics that would, I know, be helpful for your analysis, but we have not done that at this point.
And then my other question is, we spoke back in November about looking at developing this best practices guide that you mentioned staff are currently working on. How many of these different provisions that are here about community engagement and whatnot is actually part of this best practices guide that we had talked about developing?
The best practices guide at this time are mainly related to the community engagement, and that was at the direction of council from the last time we engaged on that. So a lot of the items that talk about any sort of best practices around public meetings or notification, those are in the best practices guide and are still being developed, and we're taking these conversations into account as well as we work toward finalizing that. They do have the ability to scale those with the best practices guide, scale the best practice to the type of project and the size and intensity that we're looking at. So we will be continuing to work on that after these meetings as they inform them.
And then my last question is, when I look at the letter that came from the Eastside Affordable Housing Coalition and the 34 organizations that they represent, I wanted to understand, so one of the things we had talked about is putting certain things in the funding agreements. And if I look at this list, they look very familiar to me. So what percentage of these types of housing do we expect not to have any funding at all from the city, so they would not be part of they would not have a funding agreement that they would be subject to for funding coming from the city? Do you have a sense for that?
I do not have a specific sense. Trisner, Nick, I'm not sure if you have any of that research. I do know that we have a lot of the larger ones. We are funding partners, as evidenced by the Elahi and the Plymouth projects, but I do not have a percentage.
Okay, thanks.
Let's see. I'll go to you, Councilmember Barksdale, and we're still on Councilmember Robertson's amendment.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to apologize in advance. My laptop is kind of noisy. Councilmember Zahn had the similar questions that I had about the impact. I just was curious if you could paint a picture of the types of residents that we're talking about here that would take advantage of these services. Close this.
Residences or residents?
Residents. So
Yeah.
sorry.
It's a really varied population. You have some people who may be coming out of domestic violence situations and are looking for a safe place to land, all the way to somebody who has substance abuse issues and is in recovery and is working on that. So there's such a wide range. I know that Plymouth Housing serves a certain population, and then we look at Mary's Place that generally serves women with children and families. So we do have quite a variety. We also have in this permanent supportive housing, you could have people who have left transitional housing and they're one step away from their own apartment in a market rate unit. So just varied across the board.
And just to clarify, this is for permanent supportive housing right now, not other forms of housing that we're talking about? Is that correct?
Yes, the amendment is for.
Oh, it applies to, it primarily applies to the over 30 days. I don't think it makes any change to the ones that are under 30 days. And it doesn't, I wanted to correct something. I don't think I'm not adding a CUP for anything, I don't believe. Yeah, because Liz said that it was. It's just for some permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, and indoor emergency shelter of more than 30 days. So, I hope that clarifies.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I don't have my notes now, but I really wanted to understand the reason I asked that question is to understand the impact, potential impact, but I know we don't have the data to say. But we do have the experience of CFH in terms of, as you mentioned, the additional time in terms of process and cost. Can you speak to that a little bit, just the impact there, if we know?
I can speak anecdotally, as I was involved in the permitting process. The homeless services permit process is much more intensive, I believe, than what Councilmember Robertson is suggesting in her amendments. But in that case, there is a conditional use permit requirement, and there is also a requirement for a Good Neighbor Advisory Committee, which did add quite a bit of time to the processing of that permit. We also had multiple public meetings required by code, which also added time and complexity. So I believe the costs are carrying costs for the land. The costs are staff to develop materials and attend all of those meetings. So some of those costs are really just fact-based and dependent on each project and the scale of the project itself. So it would be, I can't really assume one size fits all, but those are some of the areas. The other area that is impacted is in staff, city staff time. I know our time in terms of supporting the Good Neighbor Committee was quite extensive, and we did have a lot of staff time from many different departments, including fire and police and others associated with that project.
Yeah, and the reason even though this doesn't add a CUP, just really take a note of how, when we add sort of restrictions, it can impact the project. And just, if I remember correctly, the like the code of conduct and security plan and so forth might already be covered by other plans, like the police already have a plan for how they're going to engage, and the leases, as you mentioned before. I think I'll end there. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. So first of all, I want to thank Councilmember Robertson for bringing this forward. I too am a fan of the Redmond Code. So really glad to see that in our packet for us to discuss this evening. Then I wanted to say a big thank you to all the residents that weighed in on this important topic. As everyone probably saw, we heard from a lot of residents, a lot of community leaders. Those community leaders that probably represent more than just themselves, for those people that are at work or couldn't get to a computer or what have you, they were able to weigh in. And I think that's really important for us to take that consideration seriously. So, and for me, the message from residents was very clear: strike a balance. Yes, we want to have common sense requirements while providing a path to permanent supportive housing for Bellevue residents that may be experiencing homelessness. I think that's an important distinction that Councilmember Robertson brought up. It's something that we use at the Human Services Commission. When we're looking at the Human Services Fund, usually the first question is this going to help Bellevue residents? So I think there should be certainly a leaning towards, first and foremost, helping those that are experiencing homelessness from Bellevue. Of course, there are others, and we should help them as well, but we should focus on that. So, I think for me, this brings up, the conversations we had back in 2017 and 2018 with the shelter. But as you rightly pointed out, Liz, this is nowhere as near as, I don't think, as challenging some of these requirements as the shelter. But the shelter was, a unique service and building and different residents that would be living in there. So, and we really need to have a certain level of accountability. And I think that number of speakers tonight had mentioned that. And that's why I really think we need to have some real teeth to this, or else just hoping that some of these operators and providers are going to follow our requirements may not happen. And I'm really trying to be thoughtful in terms of being proactive and not thinking about the providers that are providing amazing services in our city right today. But there's, certainly a possibility that, there's other providers that are not as accountable as a CFH or a LifeWire or a Sophia Way. These are great providers, and we are so lucky to have them in our community. But what does that look like going forward without those providers in our city? So these are some of the things that I've been thinking about, and also just about how important it is to go through that process, because as the mayor I think brought up last time this was in front of us, we had quite a few residents that were against that Eastgate campus. Once we decided to include them, once we heard them, that really came together, and we actually had residents do a complete 180 in terms of they were serving on CFH board, they were serving on staff, they were volunteering for that organization because they were heard and they wanted to be part of the solution, and they want people to feel welcome in our city. They just wanted their considerations and concerns to be taken into account, which we did. And I think that is now going to be a successful project. And it's because we stopped and listened to the residents. I hope all of my colleagues will do that. But I certainly support Councilmember Robertson's amendments as is, and would like to see that be put into the code. Thank you.
Councilmember Lee.
Madam Mayor, right off the bat, I support Councilmember Robertson's proposed amendments. I talked to her extensively, and I also have heard and seen a lot of email from the residents. We're doing this to serve. We heard today, in the public speaking, primary goal is to serve Bellevue and its residents. And of course, this is a regional problem and a regional issue, and we want to be able to help as much as we can. But it really depends on, our scope, our ability, our own priority, and we have lots of things on our table, on our plate. So we need to take care of ourselves in a very important issue, very urgent, because it's taking care of Bellevue's residents who are in an unfortunate position. As I mentioned way back, even 30 years ago, when Arch is taking care of women that are in situation that they can help, family breakup, situations that they have families to take care of. So we do those. And now the situation obviously has changed and have increased significantly, and we realize that. That's why we are coming with this process to take care of that. And I think it's very important we do so. And, as I mentioned, my deputy mayor mentioned, we have done a good job, I believe, in the homeless shelter, working with the Congregation for Homeless and working with what we come up with on Eastgate. And the public were very much concerned about it. And so we went through a lot of due diligence, and we didn't take the shortcut. We didn't say that was easier. We didn't take the position of cost less money. No, because it's important. We want to do it right. And the problem we have in the region is we have a lot of people working on this, throwing money at things, doing it haphazardly, and it ends up that we create more problem than we actually try to solve. So I think we've done a good job, and I believe that it's important that we, agree that we have to look at best practices, and we still have some more to come, in doing outreach. It's important, and outreach means that letting people on so that they see transparency. It also means that the providers, today we have got providers, good providers. Homeless shelter has good providers, and we have worked with them very successfully. But we don't know what the future looks like. So we need to be sure that we have safeguards for the future. So I believe in funding agreement. It's very important because that provides us the flexibility and the opportunity to make sure that whatever we do, it's going to be the way that it's appropriate and good and right for Bellevue. So I also believe in that cost is important. I appreciate what CFH mentioned. If we go through a process, it will cost more money. However, it's important. We want to make sure it's right. So we don't want to do it as, for expediency. Well, let's save money. So let's shortchange something. We cannot do that. The most important piece of it is to hear from the public. Now we heard them. We make sure we have agreements. We have good providers. But 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, we don't know. So we need to have an opportunity to have, fund agreements. It's important. And as you mentioned, we're going to have best practices. So when we get best practices, we learn more. When we learn more, we want to build into our agreement these good best practices if it's appropriate for the city of Bellevue. So that's important. We have that flexibility, that we have the ability to make sure that the public will be heard, and they are being heard now. They will be heard in the future, and we make sure that we incorporate what is right for Bellevue and for its residents. So I believe, the Deputy Mayor said that, give us accountability, give the providers accountability, and so that, we listen to the public. The public has the opportunity to make sure, ensure that we do the right thing for them.
Thank you, Councilmember Lee.
So I support Councilmember Robertson's amendment. Thank you.
Great. Councilmember Stokes.
Councilmember, okay. I'll start off and say I totally support the proposal from the Planning Commission and from staff. There may be a tweak on one of the things in here, but.
Can you speak to the amendment that's on the table, which is Councilmember Robertson's change to the Planning Commission?
Yes, ma'am. I am.
Okay.
Okay, that's the point. I'm just, let me start over because I was responding to something, but.
Okay.
Which didn't get stopped. As I said, we've looked at these. We've studied this for a long time. As I was thinking about earlier today, I thought, like Yogi Berra said, it's deja vu all over again. We've been working on this since 2017-18. We were working on the temporary shelter in one location for a long time, and huge battles about that, back and forth. It didn't get done. It's taken 7, 8, 9 years, and it's still not completed. It's going forward now. And the thing we've learned from that is that a lot of people have gone without adequate housing in that time period. We don't have the time to come back and you take the proposal, or as presented, made it sound like there are just a few tweaks here, a few things to do it. But when you look at attachment G on page 10, I mean, that'll take a lot of time, and it's very detailed, and it is a way to confine this or to make it so that it's impossible to do this, because when you listen to a lot of people in the community, and everybody has their opinion, but there are a lot of people who have weighed in who are very supportive of this proposal as the Planning Commission and staff have presented. We talked a lot about CFH and Sophia's Way, Mary's Place. Sophia's Way and Mary's Place are actually putting this in place now. And they did work with the community, and this will happen with the proposal as from the commission. What is being added to this is a ton of work that is not going to be very productive except to put a damper on the provision of of housing, permanent or effective housing for people who need to be there. And these are people who are in Bellevue. And a lot of them are people that we know that are friends or relatives or children or from other people. And yes, there are people from the rest of the region. We're not an island in ourselves. And it concerns me also, we're wanting to look at another city, Redmond. We always talk about the Bellevue Way. Now we want to do the Redmond Way. I looked at Redmond's, and Redmond is way behind us on this, behind us on a lot of these things in this area. And it just is, we spent a lot of time, and obviously the community has had communications. To say that we need to now start having a lot of communication with the community is just a repetitive thing. It's a thing to delay and to undermine our effort to get people who need help, citizens or people who are just visiting here are from, from Redmond or Kirkland or, but who need help, and get them. And we have we're always complaining and worried about homeless people being out there. The solution is not to put them in jail or treat them like they're not worth anything. It's to work with them and get them in housing. And now, not 5, 10 years from now, which who knows what will happen in the future. We put this in place, there'll be arguments about this forever. And I think we're going to miss a grand opportunity to really do something great. And frankly, there's a lot of support from this from people who look at Bellevue and want to make Bellevue even greater than it is. There are people in the private industry, there are people in the community who know that doing this right and getting it in place and get people off the streets, give them help, is what we need to deal with it and not act like Seattle or some other places. And the other factor is that, there's some talk about CFH again, and there were some comments and some here acting as if CFH is supporting the amendments. David Dowling wrote us a letter. I talked to him about this after the letter. I was surprised to get it, but because another former council member wrote a letter saying that he's worked with Dave, and Dave is all supportive for this and acted as if CFH is. And he said, I agree with the Planning Commission and with the staff's recommendation. He said, that is the way to go. He said, we wasted years and people's lives in trying to make the other piece not really work. So I think we have something that is a compromise with a lot of people. And all of a sudden, it's this idea that somewhere or other, and some of the council members are saying, well, it's okay. If it costs us a lot more money, if it takes us 10 years to get to it, that's the better way to go. No, that's not right. You can't that is not the Bellevue way. Maybe it is sometimes. But frankly, we have a very, very good package here. We have an understanding. We have a good staff. We have a planning commission. We have individuals in the community. Plymouth, there are a lot of people who know how to do this. There's a lot of detail in the plan already that holds them accountable. This is just, to me, playing games with this, and we're playing games with people's lives, and we're not playing games with people's lives in the housing, the regular, people who live in housing now, because that is something that this will actually have a very positive effect on, of helping and getting people off the street and getting people in dire circumstances to come in. And we have this tremendous opportunity now, and I just hope we don't blow it and look back 10 years from now and say, wow, how come we have so many more homeless people? How come we haven't dealt with this? How come we, let's write up another thing with this. And then the other thing is I just don't want to have to deal with the state when the state comes down and says, well, can't you read? So we need to do this now. There is plenty of, everybody's working together. Staff is on top of this. The Planning Commission, council members can work on this. People in the community, we have a lot of people in the community. Again, Mary's Place, Sophia Way, Congregation of the Homeless, the other providers. There are 3, I think 2 or 3 actually housing like this already existing in Bellevue and has for some time.
So I'm going to deduce that you do not support Councilmember Robertson's amendment.
I just said that at the beginning, yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to say that I really appreciate Councilmember Robertson's work on this, and the points that you bring up are very thoughtful. And I agree that a lot of these things should be in the best practices guide or in a funding agreement. But I don't believe they belong in a land use code amendment. And I too respect the Planning Commission's recommendation without any changes. So I'm looking forward to staff bringing back the best practices guide, and I typed up what Mary's Place did, and I think I emailed everybody to look at it, for future conversation, and I'm looking forward to seeing what a funding agreement might look like. And I think we can cover a lot of the concerns that have been brought up in those two things, but I do not want to delay the permitting of an essential service, which I believe we are doing here with this land use code amendment. So I do not support this amendment myself. Do we want to go back around, or are we ready to vote? You go ahead.
So,
and again, this is to do with your amendment.
right. So, and I had a question for Charmaine, and I emailed it to you, but you didn't see it. So, if the amendment does not pass, is it in order for me to bring separate amendments for components of this, either tonight or when this comes back?
So that would be considered a reconsideration. The question would be, is this final direction from council?
So it's not, is it? So it would be in order.
Yeah, I believe so. You can do that this evening or at the next meeting. However, it does have to be made, that motion to reconsider does have to be made by someone on the prevailing side.
No, but it wouldn't be a motion to reconsider. It would be, tonight we're giving direction of what ordinance to bring back.
I see. You're asking if you bring that back at final action.
If I bring individual amendments forward at the next meeting, whether it's next week or some later time, would that be in order?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that.
Yep.
And then I had a question. Actually, I can wait till we take a vote, and then I'll ask the question about the Planning Commission. I just want to compare. I had a question for staff about comparing the two on one point. Can I ask that? Okay, so under the Planning Commission draft, as written without the amendments, am I correct that a provider could buy every house, every other house on a single-family street and put 16 residents in each house on that street, say 7 different houses in a one-block area? That would be legal, wouldn't it?
I believe there would be no prohibition against that. Do you have any other thoughts?
There wouldn't be any prohibition in the land use code for that use. That would be still consistent, assuming that their on-site services, for instance, aren't being used by outside residents and such. But I believe there would be consideration for building codes and fire codes and other codes.
Right, I mean, you can't stack people like cords of wood, nor would you ever want to. But if the house is big enough to have, well, we don't even have a residential occupancy limit. So if there was 8 bedrooms and they wanted to put 3 persons per bedroom and put 24 people in a single-family home, 4 on a block, they could do that. It's consistent with the land use code as drafted.
As drafted, it is consistent with it. There is the provision that Nick Whipple talked about too, in terms of maintaining the residential character of the homes.
Right.
So assuming they do that.
And if all the providers wanted to snap up land in Factoria or Eastgate where it's less expensive and put all of the permanent supportive housing and transitional housing in Eastgate and Factoria, there's nothing in the land use code that would prohibit that, right?
That's right.
Okay. So that's just an example of why we need spacing and occupancy, particularly in the single-family zones. So I see how the vote's going to go, but we go ahead and take it. I will be bringing back targeted amendments to discuss issues like I just raised if this does not pass tonight.
Any other comments or questions? Councilmember Lee, followed by Deputy Mayor. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I heard the Madam Mayor's concern about not wanting to delay this process. And I want to ask the staff, what kind of delay will we have? We want to move forward fast. If we approve the amendment, I mean, you can just do it, right? So I just want to know, maybe there's a delay. What kind of delay we're looking at? 10 years? 6 months? 1 month? I don't know. So let's have some real information. Okay, so that's my question for the staff.
One of the delays would be in reviewing the code amendments that Councilmember Robertson has proposed. We have not done any sort of legal analysis on those from our city attorney's office, nor have we done review with an equity lens at that point. So because we did just receive those, we have not had an opportunity to do that. So there would be some delay while we moved it through and reviewed it and confirmed that it was through our city attorney's office consistent with state regulations and the need in Bellevue. In terms of delay to projects being permitted, which I believe Councilmember Stokes was speaking to, there certainly would be additional time involved in some of the review of the submittal requirements that were proposed in Councilmember Robertson's proposals. But without a actual code or a application, it's hard to determine what sort of timing delay that could invoke. I certainly don't think it would be 10 years. So.
Okay, follow up. Well, obviously, there will be potentially delays on anything we do. Whether we change anything or not, we don't know, right? So hopefully, will not be so onerous. People are ready to do it. My question is for our own legal to review the amendments. I mean, what's realistically, how much would time to take? 1 month, 2 weeks, 1 week?
I think it's really hard for us to answer that. That's probably something that the city attorney's office can provide. That
Okay, I think that's what
timing.
We need to know. Yeah, I mean, everything we do is a benefit and cost, right? That means time or money. So we need to know real terms in order to make decisions. If we just say that, so well, let's decide that, that's not realistic. Okay, so let's make sure. I really appreciate, Councilman Boxley always asking, get real numbers, real data, so that we know exactly what we're looking at, so we can make those priorities, tough choices we're making. Okay, so thank you.
You have something to offer, Kathy?
All I was going to say is I think the length of time it takes us to look at it may depend upon the scope of the amendments that we're asked to look at. So, if Councilmember Robertson had sounded like some targeted amendments, that would certainly shorten the time.
Hey, Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, in some ways I wish, we were to have some additional documents ready and approved, such as the best practices guide, before getting to this point. That's the way it should work, I think, and it would make this conversation a little bit easier as well. And I appreciate Councilmember Stokes' passion for this, but at the same time, I don't think no one here is trying to delay. No one here wants to put people into jail. No one's playing games. We all care about those that are unhoused in our community. I want to make that very clear, including Councilman Robertson, who brought this forward. Now, I want to bring up specifically two items, but one has most of my interest because I hear all the time living in East Bellevue, okay, living in Lake Hills, okay? Time and time again, and it may not be always accurate, but Lake Hills, Eastgate, Factoria, not that Bellevue is, greatly affordable, but if you were to purchase property in Bellevue, most likely, where would you go? Eastgate, Lake Hills, Factoria. And there is a real chance here that all of these would be clustered very, very closely together, right beside the Eastgate campus and Eastgate as well. Now, that alone necessarily isn't a problem, but we have to look at this, again, being proactive, and if we truly are a united city, we should have this dispersed across the city and not clustered in one area. This seems like very common sense to me. Residents already feel in East Bellevue that they are the dumping ground for any project that downtown doesn't want or another ritzy neighborhood doesn't want. It goes to East Bellevue. I don't think that's always the case, but you have to take in consideration already what's in those areas. I live right next door to Section 8 housing in Bellevue. Now we're going to start adding additional homes right near that, and we got the Eastgate campus. My point is that that could cause some issues at some time, potentially, and I think we need to take that in consideration. So I really do appreciate Councilmember Robertson's one amendment. She does bring it back to have at least, I believe it's half-mile separation between different, and I think it's only fair. I think, and equitable, and I think all residents want to be a part of this solution. I don't think one community, or one neighborhood, I should say, should have the vast majority of all of them right in that place, or in that specific neighborhood. I also like to see brought back as a separate amendment the Bellevue Police Department review the safety plan. I do not think that would take a lot of time. And I think that would help ensure for residents and neighbors that all precautions are being thought out, are in place. I think that would give a lot of residents just some sense of security that they have taken a look at it. So I'd like to see that come back as well. But again, I appreciate Councilmember Robertson bringing this forward.
Councilmember Zahn.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I appreciate listening to my colleagues speak about this topic and making sure we get this right. What I kept thinking about is the speaker that came as part of the Eastside Affordable Housing Coalition. And so here's what I was thinking about. If there was a cul-de-sac that had a home for LGBTQ youth, and then several houses down there was one for veterans, would we say that that was unacceptable? And I'm also thinking about, as we look at broadly housing, if we had a cul-de-sac where the homes are almost all rentals, do we have any special provisions or requirements related to someone wanting to rent their home? So as I think about the equity lens and what we're actually putting in place here, I want to make sure that we don't create unintended consequences and impact to the policies we're actually putting in the land use code, different than if we're talking about best practices of how we best make sure that we're all good neighbors to each other, that we are not creating unintended consequences from this, because I can envision scenarios where the idea that we're gonna say that they needed to be a half mile away from each other, is that what the provision was? I'm not sure that that's really what we're trying to say to the community at large in Bellevue. So thank you.
So I'll just say that I live downtown just to sympathize with you. And I've got some arts units in our building, and we have Section 8 senior housing around the corner, and another big complex down the street. And the beauty of it is that they're all great buildings, they're all well maintained, and the people are part of, an integral and important part of the community. So I prefer the variety that we have, and I think it is really all over our city. We just don't know it because they don't stand out as affordable. Any other comments or questions? Go ahead.
So I appreciate the discussion. I guess one of the things I appreciated most was hearing the goal or the outcome that we're trying to achieve with each amendment. So when that comes back, it'd be great to have that so we could discuss different ideas to achieve that goal. And then my only concern with the Redmond Code is I don't know that it's been implemented, so we don't know the impact of those changes on being able to actually carry out permanent supportive housing needs or address the permanent supportive housing needs. So maybe if there's an opportunity to understand the implications of those decisions, maybe by talking to if we haven't already, providers. And I still am interested, and I think Councilmember Zahn brought this up, in the impact to the actual people that we're trying to serve with these changes that would allow for development of permanent supportive housing.
So we have a vote to take on Councilmember Robertson's amendment, and I'm going to ahead call for the vote. So all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
No.
Okay, can you do a hand if you said aye? Raise your hand.
For what?
For support, for aye for the amendment? Okay, 3, and raise your hand if you said nay. Okay, so 3 to 4, it does not pass, but that is not the end of your ideas, because we'll see them back individually. And look forward to hearing your discussion about it, but also the staff's discussion with it. So thank you for bringing this forward. So we have another amendment, but I'm going to ask if we could take a quick break. We just voted on the first amendment. No, we're going to have another amendment before we vote on the motion that's on the table. All right, so we're going to take a quick break, if you don't mind, and I'll get us back to where we are. Come back at 5 till. Going to resume our discussion. So we still have a motion on the floor to accept the Planning Commission's recommendation. And I believe we have another amendment that Councilmember Barksdale would like to make.
All right, thank you, Mayor. So this is related to emergency housing, and specifically the idea of splitting the emergency housing into transient and non-transient. I'll start off just asking a couple of questions of staff, if I might, or may. Is that okay, or should I just?
Well, should you make your motion first, so we know what you're talking about?
Oh, okay.
Your amendment.
Amendment.
No motion for your amendment, sorry.
So I move that we remove the distinction between transient and non-transient emergency housing, which would move it out of the homeless services uses and just be emergency housing.
Do we have a visual for that, perchance?
Yes, Mayor, I believe we could pull up, we would need to pull up the slide. Do you have your video now?
No, but
Okay.
we do have the slides that you had as possibles.
This one? Yeah, we could direct you to slide number 9.
Okay.
And slide number 10.
Okay.
I can go ahead and
So
start.
can you restate your motion, Councilmember Barksdale?
That we remove the distinction, so basically keep the current, which is just emergency housing, not a distinction between transient and non-transient emergency housing, which means it would no longer be in the transient emergency housing would not exist in the homeless services uses.
So it would no longer require a CUP?
Correct.
Okay. Would you like to speak to it or ask?
Is there a second?
Oh, yeah. Is there a second? Okay.
So the main ideas here is the need for the CUP, but also because emergency housing, as I understand it, and staff, please clarify if I get this wrong, but one of the main intentions of it is to provide housing for people who are at risk of homelessness or people who are immediately who just experienced homelessness. And one of the things that we've talked about is homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing. And I think there's, again, just talking about the barriers and the impact of putting those barriers in place. We've heard about the impact of the CUP on CFH. We've also talked about the impact of CUP, having a CUP on private development when we talked about East Main. And so I think it's going to make it more difficult for us to build the housing that we need that would support even the goals of rapid rehousing or homelessness prevention. But I guess my question for staff here, if you want to comment on that, but also I don't know that we have, is there any distinction made in emergency housing anywhere else with any of our neighboring cities?
To the best of my knowledge, there is not that distinction. I did ask staff earlier today if there was. We do not know of any at this time. We've not done a holistic review, so, but nothing that I'm aware of at this time.
Okay, we have a second. Councilmember Stokes, let's start with you. Any comments or questions on this amendment that Councilmember Barksdale just made?
Yeah, I think it has merit, and I think it, again, helps with the goal of getting assistance and helping people as quickly as possible, and instead of going through what may be just a process that really doesn't add to the subject matter.
Okay. Councilmember Lee.
I really don't know what impact are we talking about. So are we saying that homeless shelters can be sited without going through any regulation, no CUP requirement?
This would be for emergency housing versus emergency shelters.
So can you elaborate so I understand what we're talking about? I don't know, the public knows.
Can you describe, staff, what emergency housing is? Why don't you describe all the different ones?
Okay, I'll go ahead and start in, and I would welcome any additions from my colleagues. The shelter, the emergency shelter is generally relegated to stays that are approximately 1 day, 24 hours in length. So it may be that somebody comes back to the shelter. So think of the East Side Men's Shelter that we just permitted for congregations for the homeless. The people may come in, they may stay for the night, they may stay for a portion of the morning, and then they leave. They may or may not come back that night. There's no real permanence to that relationship. It is very transient in nature. As the code is written now, the transient emergency housing is for those people that are going to stay in locations less than 30 days. So somewhere between 24 hours and 30 days. It's still not a permanent lease arrangement. You may come in, you need maybe you have lost your home for some reason and you need a couple of weeks bridge between your home and your next location. So it's a short-term stay. It's not meant to be anything longer than 30 days. After 30 days, we start to call that, in the code that the Planning Commission proposed, we would call that transient housing. So I'm sorry, not transient housing, we would call it emergency housing. Transient is the 24 hours to 30 days. Anything beyond that would just be considered transient housing or permanent supportive housing, depending on, how people were using the space.
Okay, so Councilmember Barksdale's amendment is to
Remove the distinction between transient and non-transient emergency housing.
Well, we have emergency shelter, transient emergency housing, and emergency housing. So using those terms, can you?
Yeah, maybe can you just.
I can try and help, and I think Trisha may have some suggestions.
So there are really 4 housing types that we're talking about here, right?
What's the fourth?
We have supportive housing, permanent supportive housing. We have transitional housing. We have emergency housing, and we have indoor emergency shelter. For the emergency housing that Councilmember Barksdale is proposing, we have actually separated those out between transient, so less than 30 days, and non-transient, 30 days or more. The transient one, we have, at least as written now, the code looks at that as a homeless services uses, so similar to an indoor emergency shelter because of the kind of transitory nature of those stays. My understanding, Councilmember Barksdale, is that you're proposing that we don't have the distinction anymore between transient emergency housing and non-transient emergency housing, so that emergency housing would be treated just like the permanent supportive housing and transitional housing, where it would not require any additional process in most of the locations, and it would be allowed in all the land use districts where residential and hotels and motel uses are allowed. Does that help?
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. I think the impact could be significant. I don't know. I've not heard any public response on this or input this is a brand-new, situation. Do you have something that you can show that it's working somewhere so
I don't think staff has had time.
I can have an understanding, or we can wait until we have more conversation on this? Otherwise, I would not be able to say yea or nay. I mean, you have problem figuring it out. I have problem. I think the public would have problems. So I would like to be more, diligent to understand what it means and impact it is. So I can't go
Let's
for
let
it now.
staff respond.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. And I just want to mention that the Planning Commission did get this suggestion from some of the public commenters to include emergency housing as its own kind of category without splitting them up. They did consider that. We had, at the time, we explained that this, the way we split them up is because we have that in our land use code framework for other residential uses. We do distinguish between transient and non-transient stays and durations. So the Planning Commission ultimately decided not to combine and make that recommendation as part of their recommendation to you all.
Okay, Deputy Mayor.
Those that brought that forward during the Planning Commission, were those providers? Were they the public? Or can you be more specific about who brought that idea forward?
Yes, Deputy Mayor. So the providers, I believe it was the East Side Affordable Housing Convening, brought that recommendation forward.
Okay, thank you. It's an interesting idea, like Councilmember Lee. I would need to know more. I need to know the impact, what that means for the overall code, impact to residents and the neighborhood. So for me, I would say no at this point, but I would welcome Councilmember Barksdale to bring it back as a separate amendment along with Councilmember Robertson for consideration at that time.
With staff input.
Yes.
Councilmember Zahn.
So what I was trying to understand is if we were to pursue this, then it would have the process about registration and public notice that is part of the supportive housing? Is that right?
That would only apply in the circumstance where over 25% of the floor area was devoted to the supportive services, so it would follow the same permitting path as any of the other supportive housings.
Okay, and do we have a sense for what the likely requests are for emergency housing between transient and non-transient? So I guess, again, kind of understanding the impact and.
We do not at this time. We have just brought this forward tonight, so this is the first time we've really discussed this, so we don't have any of those details at this time.
And then I guess my last question is, if it was left the way it's currently written, a CUP requirement means that you go through the process and you will be approved, or you go through the process and you may be rejected? What does that mean?
In any conditional use permit, there is some possibility that the permit would be denied. It is a recommendation is made by the Director of Development Services to the hearing examiner, who would then make that decision on the conditional use permit. So there would always be some risk in any conditional use permit.
Okay, so potentially for emergency housing, that by lumping it with emergency shelter, we potentially are going to create a barrier to the ability to have this housing?
It would require, it does require a lot of process, so certainly that can be seen as a barrier, but there is quite a bit of process associated with the homeless services use path.
Right, for a category that's actually housing and not homeless services. Right.
As the Planning Commission defined it, because of its transitory nature, they did actually look at it as a homeless service use. versus the permanent supportive housing classification, which they did look at more as housing. So in the current draft, it is a separated out when it is the transient nature.
Thank you.
Councilmember Robertson.
So, yeah, I was just looking at the definition, and it's really hard for me to, that's why I always draft my things up and print them in the packet so that people can have a fair chance to actually understand the amendments. So I'm not really understanding the impacts of this, and I would have to see it in the context of the code to understand it. That said, I was looking at the Bellevue Code on homeless services, and it defines an overnight shelter as a facility that's constructed for the primary purpose of providing shelter for people experiencing homelessness in general or for specific populations of people experiencing homelessness. Support services may or may not be provided. How is that different than the definition for transient emergency housing? Is that in the code?
There are definitely similarities on all of these different,
I don't know.
different housing types and different use categories.
Is that in the draft code?
There is a definition for emergency housing transient as well
Indoor
as
accommodation for individuals or families who are homeless or at imminent risk of becoming homeless that is intended to address the basic, that's the definition right out of the RCW, I recognize that. So it's a slight difference, but it doesn't seem like it's much of a difference. Not understanding this and thinking that, thinking how the Planning Commission had the chance, they've chewed on this issue a lot. And they ultimately came down to siding with staff on considering the transient emergency housing really akin to a homeless use. And when the Planning Commission and the staff are in agreement on something like that, and they've chewed on it a lot, and really the only folks advocating for something different are the people who are the providers and not necessarily the clients or the neighborhoods or anything else. It's not something I really think is probably a middle ground supported by everyone's solution. So although I am open to considering how this would work, I do not support it.
So I feel similarly to Councilmember Robertson. I feel like the Planning Commission had an entire year to think about making a change like this. And as much as I appreciate the permanent men's shelter that we're building in Eastgate and see the need for it, I'm a huge fan of supportive housing and want to make that as easy to build as possible, because the data suggests that that is such a successful way to get people, A, into stable housing and permanently into stable housing, and B, help them respond to services really well. It's far more stable than a shelter. And the third thing is, I think it's really hard for people who are experiencing homelessness to want to come into a shelter. You know, a shelter is not an ideal situation, and it's better than sleeping outside in the rain, and you have opportunities for services, but it's not your own room. It's not your own place. You don't have a door. And you really have to get along with all the people there with you. And, you know, everybody in this room has trouble getting along with certain people. And it's just not, you know, it's group housing, and it's tough. So I'm inclined to say no to this amendment myself, but I really do want to support the people who are outside getting into stable housing as best we can. I think that's more through more supportive housing. But it would be great to see pros and cons on this. It would be great to see the answers to the questions. I don't know if you want to go ahead with a vote or if you want to withdraw your motion and bring it up after we get more information, but it's up to you.
I'm happy to withdraw and bring it back if that sounds like there was interest to bring it back in consideration.
I'm thinking Councilmember Zahn.
I'm just wondering, when you bring it back, whether there is a gradation of of requirement? Is there something else other than a CUP that, for this type of emergency housing transient, that is a less process cumbersome piece, but still provides that opportunity to have some of that dialogue, and whether that might be something Councilmember Barksdale would want the staff to consider as you reflect on what might make sense to bring back.
Any other questions for staff to bring information back on? So the motion on the table that we have in front of us is to direct staff to prepare the permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, emergency housing, and emergency shelter LUCA ordinance for final action at a future meeting as recommended by the Planning Commission, which is what Deputy Mayor proposed. I think we can vote on that direction, and with knowing that we will have a long discussion during that decision-making process to consider Councilmember Robertson's new singular amendments and Councilmember Barksdale's amendment. So with that, I'm going to call for the vote. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
No.
Okay, so I didn't hear everybody vote. Can you raise your hand if you vote yes to have staff bring this back? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And raise your hand if you say no, you don't want staff to bring it back. Okay, you're abstaining.
No.
Okay, so 1 no and one abstention.
It'll be counted as a yes.
Yeah, I thought you were voting for the.
All right, so we have 5-1 and a abstain.
Abstentions are counted in the positive. Yes.
Just calling it out for you. Okay, very good. So, whew, we're on to the next study session item, Mr. Miyake.
Thank you, Mayor and council members. The second and last topic on your study session agenda this evening is the proposed land use code amendment to remove references to the East Bellevue Community Council from the land use code and to provide regulatory consistency citywide by adopting previously disapproved ordinances within the East Bellevue Community Council jurisdiction area. And just by way of background, this proposed land use code amendment responds to recently enacted state legislation sunsetting the East Bellevue Community Council and other community councils in the state of Washington by way of House Bill 1769. So tonight, staff is seeking direction to enter a finding of necessity for council to process this land use code amendment and to direct staff to schedule the public hearing. So joining us this evening are, is Liz there too? Oh, okay, I guess it's not. It's Trisna Tanis, consulting attorney, as well as Nick Whipple, code and policy planning manager. And with that, I'll turn it over to you for presentation.
Great. Thank you, City Manager Miyake. Good evening again, Mayor Robinson, Deputy Mayor Nunez, council members. I think we should have our presentation up, hopefully. Thank you for having us here to introduce and present this East Bellevue Community Council EBCC Sunset Land Use Code Amendment, or LUCA. Sorry, getting distracted. It's a little.
And if you could give us a slide number
Yes.
as you progress them, then we can stay with you.
Of course. Okay, so slide 2. For action tonight, we are asking for council to retain processing of this LUCA and to direct scheduling of the public hearing at a future meeting. Okay, for our agenda on this item, we'll start by providing some background information, including an explanation of this, the state regs that we're responding to. We will go through the objectives of this LUCA and then explain the components of the LUCA. We'll also describe the required process and our plan for next steps. And then we'll recap the direction that we're looking for. As an aside, the photo that you see on the right here is a historical photo taken in the late 1950s of the Lake Hills area, which is, of course, in the EBCC area. Okay, the next slide, and slide 4. The EBCC jurisdictional area is what you see on the right-hand map on the slide. The area is bounded by Northeast 8th to the north, 156th Avenue Southeast to the east, and just past Robbinswood Park to the south and crossing Kelsey Creek back up north on the west side. The ABCC was established in 1969, so just some years after that photo was taken. Its creation was a condition of the area's annexation into Bellevue, into the city. The ABCC is one of 2 remaining community councils in the state, and the other one is Houghton in Kirkland. So the ABCC is made up of 5 residents of the East Bellevue area. It's empowered by the Community Municipal Corporation Statute, or Chapter 3514 of the RCW. The ABCC has approval and disapproval authority over certain land use actions within the area. And it also may act in an advisory capacity on other land use issues that directly or indirectly affect this jurisdictional area. So slide 5, in this past legislative session, the state legislature passed and the governor signed into law House Bill 1769. It amended that community municipal corporation statute to sunset community councils in the state. This sunset will occur on July 8th, at which point the community councils, including the ABCC, will no longer exist. Currently, because the ABCC's authority to approve or disapprove zoning ordinances and other land use controls over the past 5 decades or so, there are inconsistencies in regulations that apply to the ABCC area versus those that apply citywide. This means that the land use code has regulations that apply only to the ABCC area, and there are regulations that apply citywide that don't apply to the ABCC area. With the sunset of the ABCC upcoming, this LUCA is proposed to apply consistent regulations throughout to achieve clarity, predictability, and equity citywide. We are asking council to retain processing of this LUCA through a finding of necessity. And because council has already made policy decisions for all of the components that we are going to go through here in this LUCA. So turning to slide 6, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Nick to go through the specific components of this LUCA.
Thank you. So the LUCA before council this evening has been sorted into 2 categories of amendments. So we have our procedural and housekeeping amendments as well as our substantive amendments. With the procedural and housekeeping amendments, it would remove the EBCC, or East Bellevue Community Council, from review processes. But it has no effect on the allowed land uses in the EBCC. And then the substantive amendments, which are changes to the uses allowed within the East Bellevue Community Council and their associated requirements, as well as they would include some changes to dimensional or design standards, and would essentially remove the East Bellevue Community Council specific provisions to extend the citywide requirements within the EBCC's historic boundary. So moving on to slide 7, some of the procedural or housekeeping amendments include changes to the light industry, the allowance for different bonuses related to height in those land use districts. So that would now be available in the EBCC. However, this change would not have an effect as there are no light industry districts in the East Bellevue Community Council. For homeless service uses, this use is regulated in the EBCC as transient lodging. So this change would extend the city's homeless service uses process and requirements to the EBCC. And then there are a number of review procedures that would be changed by this land use code amendment. So the EBCC has review, approval, or notification process steps for the different permits that are listed here. So conditional use permits, preliminary plats, final plats, planned unit developments or PUDs, and home occupation permits. So the amendment would remove the EBCC's role in those permit processes, and the citywide review and appeal procedures for those application types would then apply within that jurisdictional boundary. And moving on to our substantive amendments. So in the land use code, there is a allowance for R7.5 within our single-family land use districts. In the East Bellevue Community Council, that district does not exist or it's not acknowledged, so a rezone to R7.5 would not be possible. So this amendment would allow for the R7.5 to become available in the East Bellevue Community Council. However, there would be no immediate effect. It would just provide an opportunity for someone to petition for that rezone at a future time. And then for the land use tables, there are a number of specific provisions that apply within the EBCC as it relates to the list here. And so those would now be more consistent with the city allowance for those. And then for residential minimum parking, this is something the council recently had provided a decision on. And in the East Bellevue Community Council, the radius where you could take advantage of reduced minimum parking was set at 1/2 mile, whereas citywide it was set at or excuse me, the reverse there. So citywide, the allowance is 1/2 mile radius from a frequent transit area. You could take advantage of reduced parking. However, within the East Bellevue Community Council, that was set at 1/4 mile. So this amendment would change that to 1/2 mile, consistent with the citywide requirement. And then for regulations for trailers, boats, and large recreational vehicles, there are a different set of rules that apply within the East Bellevue Community Council as it relates to this use. And the screening requirements and parking requirements, for example, are different than those that apply citywide. So this LUCA would make those requirements consistent citywide. The other difference is the use of RVs. So within the EBCC, through a temporary use permit, RVs may be permitted on private property as a temporary dwelling for up to 1 year, whereas city regulations limit the use of an RV as a dwelling through a temporary use permit up to 30 days. So there would be a difference there. This change does not apply, however, to temporary use permits that have been issued prior to the effective date of this the passage of this LUCA in the future. And then there are a number of EBCC specific definitions that would be removed, and the citywide definitions would apply instead. So for the review process, this is a process for City Council legislative action. So the process for requirements apply, which include the notice of application as well as the notice of public hearing. Tonight is the first study session for this land use code amendment. The East Bellevue Community Council sunset date, as mentioned earlier, is on July 8th. There would be a public hearing if directed by council soon after that, sometime in July, with adoption or action that can be taken the same night, or we can reserve a separate night to take final action. And so for next steps, the LUCA application was noticed in the weekly permit bulletin on June 9th. We will be launching a project webpage as well, which will include the strike draft. The webpage will also include some contact information so people can provide public comment or ask questions. And then the site will, of course, remain up to date so people are aware of where the LUCA is at in the process. And then, of course, the notice of public hearing will be issued for this LUCA, including a staff report and recommendation, and then the public hearing will be another opportunity for the public to provide comments on the LUCA. So with that, we are seeking direction again for council to direct staff to enter, or sorry, for council to enter a finding of necessity to process this LUCA, and then direct staff to schedule the public hearing. With that, we'll turn it back to you, Mayor.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's go ahead and put the motion on the table.
Certainly, Mayor. I move to enter a finding of necessity to process this land use code amendment and direct staff to prepare the recommended LUCA for a public hearing and final action in July.
Second.
Okay, any comments or questions? Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, first of all, as a liaison to the EBCC, I want to thank everybody, all the council members for all their in some cases, many, many years of service to the EBCC. And even, I believe, Cheholeh has a distinction of probably serving the shortest term of 6 months. But all of you, Betsy Hummer is in the audience tonight. You probably had every hat on as a council member, but as well as Hassan Dhananjaya, Ron Epstein, and Steve Kasner all gave a lot of time and effort and commitment to that community council, and I think it's important to recognize that, even though it is being dissolved. Everybody's invited to the very last EBCC meeting on Thursday, the 23rd, here at City Hall, if you would like to attend and thank the council members for their service. In regards to this motion, pretty straightforward from my perspective. I think it's prudent to get consistent with the definitions, with the code, to align this with the rest of the city. So I am at this point happy to move this forward. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Go ahead, Councilmember Robertson.
So I had a couple of questions, and then I wanted to make a couple of general comments about the EBCC, which I can wait till after the vote, whatever your pleasure, Mayor. But questions are, yes, I support moving this forward, but I had two questions on the process. First, if the council wants to, because this seems like it's just a kind of a technical amendment to make us one city again, could we take action, and would staff tee it up to take action after the public hearing?
That.
Second, on the R7, thank you, I'd appreciate that. On the R7.5, on the rezone, should that be something that the Planning Commission considers doing to make the city more uniform as part of the major comp plan update?
So
I guess should and could.
Yeah, so the R7.5 is just not available in the EBCC. There's an asterisk on that land use designation to say that it's not effective within the EBCC area. So someone, let's say that they wanted to rezone their property to that land use district, they could not right now. So this LUCA would make that designation available.
Let me come at this another way. And that's great, because our 7.5 is a pretty common single-family zoning density. If the council passes the proposed ordinance that we hold a public hearing on, could then council direct Planning Commission to take up the consideration on whether certain parcels or areas within the EBCC area should have a comp plan designation that would allow 7.5? That's something that could happen as part of the major comp plan update.
I believe so, potentially. I think community development staff would probably be better suited to answer that question for you, Councilmember.
Yeah, can we get that answer the night of the public hearing? Or
yes, of course.
Or after, if this goes beyond that. All right. And Mayor, should I make my comments now?
Sure,
or should
go
we wait
ahead.
till after the vote? I wanted to join my voice to Deputy Mayor Newhouse's. EBCC's been around a long time. I'm slightly older than it, just a little. So we know it's been there for a while. And, it's funny because long before I lived in Bellevue or was a planning commissioner or council member, I was an attorney who represented EBCC for a time in the 1990s. Yeah, and the other community council. I think we had all three of the active ones at the time in my law firm in the 90s. And so I knew a lot of the old guard from the EBCC, Ken Seal and I'm blanking on his name, but some of the guys that have been around for a long time. And they were just class acts. So it's been, EBCC's been around 53 years. They've been a part of the community and part of the conversation for a long time. And there's been a lot of leaders that have served on the East Bellevue Community Council. And to a person, every single EBCC council member I've ever known were active, engaged, champions of their neighborhood, to a person. And although it's time to sunset the community council, I agree that it's time to sunset and make us one city. I don't want to dismiss the historical importance of the EBCC as liaisons and advocates for neighborhoods in Bellevue. And Betsy Hummer, former two-term chair of the EBCC, is in the audience. I also wanted to give a nod to you, Betsy, because when you came on as chair, you worked really, really hard to try to get EBCC working better and having better relations with the city, making them more connected to the commissions, to the council, to the staff. And I think that that was really a positive direction. And I have no doubt that you and all of the colleagues that you have on the EBCC are going to continue to be engaged and strong advocates for neighborhoods, your neighborhood and all neighborhoods in Bellevue. And so I want to thank you. I want to thank your colleagues. Please share with your colleagues the gratitude that Deputy Mayor Nunhaus and I, and I'm sure the rest of the council, share for your longtime service and commitment to the people of Bellevue. Thanks.
I'm going to speak, and then I'll have Councilmember Lee speak, and then Councilmember Stokes. Yes, I too want to thank you very much, Betsy, you're here, and your fellow East Bellevue Community Council people for all your dedication to your community and your work with the city. I cut my teeth on the Lake Hills issues with the boarding houses as I was getting on the council. And I really appreciated working with the community and the city council to make sure that your needs were heard and there was a response, although we had to reverse it. But, that was a great process to learn on. And I just want to let you know that same avenue is there. You have council members here who will listen to your community. You have a loud voice, and I encourage you to keep talking and keep communicating with us. So thank you for everything that you've done. And I will be supporting this motion. Councilmember Lee, followed by Councilmember Stokes.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I want to join my fellow council members to thank all the members of the Bellevue Community Council over all the years since 1969. That's a long time ago. That's 1 year after I moved to Bellevue, so it's long enough. And they have always been really, truly representing the neighborhoods. And the people who are on that, council are always definitely dedicated. I mean, they spend their time, and they are at council meetings, their community meetings. It's not just a few people get together, just plot against somebody else. They really have the interest, of this, of the East Bellevue, Lake Hills especially. Actually, Lake Hills is one of the oldest community, right? Most homes are started developing in that area. And in fact, indeed, they represent not just the Lake Hills, but they have the overall interests of the city in mind as well. And it's just a matter of the way it has happened. They represented at that time the best interests, of the city as a whole. But the city has changed, city has grown. So has Lake Hills. So the people have. But it's always maintained that the commitment, neighborhood, grassroots interest. And we hear a lot of things happening there. We have used to be Boys and Girls Club. We have the Savannah Club. We have, a lot of things going on. And so they've gone through many different challenges. Everywhere in the city that something happens that has not happened before, East Bellevue Community Council, Lake Hills area gets it first. So I think it's really important. And we see development going on. At the first one now, it's the way it is, and it's still, in transition. So thank you all. And I can't say all the names, everybody. They all know who they are, and they've come, they've gone. Like Jennifer mentioned a number of names. And so thank you, and please convey to them our sincere thanks and appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Stokes.
Yeah, I want to join in thanking you very much for all the time and service. And I think it's, things happen in time and all, and it was time for this. And I appreciated you were, particularly Betsy, were not, it wasn't, you worked with us on the inevitable in a sense, and, and that happens. And I was glad to share with Councilmember Robertson on, going down and to the, or at least virtually to the legislature and supporting the bill to end this, because I think things change, and what I'm hoping is, and I've had some conversations sometimes with different members of the council, and sometimes there was this feeling of, or kind of complaint, well, you kind of ignore us because we're the council and, these issues. Well, I think that barrier is gone, if there is one, and you can be, and you are a very important part of the city, and I think actually your contributions are going to be greater in a sense of looking at the whole picture, and the regional piece too. So we're all joining together, and I think we have great legacy and take great legacies and make them even better. So really appreciate your, particularly in this time, working through this in a very rational and helpful manner, and I'm looking forward to a great partnership with the community as part of the greater community in Bellevue. So thank you very much.
Any other, okay.
All the other people have been involved in it, so.
Councilmember Zahn, followed by Councilmember Barksdale.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I had one comment and then I wanted to give thanks as well. So my comment is when we talk about certain definitions that were in EBCC that's not citywide, when we say eliminating the EBCC specific definitions and now they're applicable citywide, does that mean that there were two definitions and one overrides the other, or that there was a definition in EBCC that didn't exist and now it's added to citywide? Can you just help me with that one?
So there were, in the examples of the definitions, there were definitions that were just specific to properties developed within the East Bellevue Community Council jurisdiction. And so those would be eliminated. And there are definitions that apply citywide that would now be applicable. And so it would just remove the definition that only applied to properties as they were developed or as they exist within that jurisdictional boundary.
And those definitions that no longer exist, are any of them, would any of them make sense to be added to the citywide that we haven't considered, or is that a separate discussion?
I believe they're duplicate definitions, if that's what you're asking. So for instance, recreational vehicle is one where there's a different definition in the EBCC versus what is applicable citywide. So the proposal is to delete the EBCC specific definition and instead just have the single definition.
Okay, all right, thank you. And then I too want to thank Betsy and the EBCC council members just for all your many years of dedicated service. I know that Lake Hills neighborhood has always been very welcoming and open to sharing information, knowledge, and dialogue and conversation, and look forward to many more years of engagement. And just thank you very, very much for all your service.
Councilmember Barksdale.
So I think, so I support the Luca, but I also think the rest of the council has already echoed my sentiments, but I do want to add that being on the Planning Commission and serving as chair, I've really enjoyed the engagement with you, Betsy, and also other EBCC council members. It's, a lot of hairy topics, but, being able to engage in depth on those topics with you all has been very rewarding. I guess I would say it's not every day that people dig into the land use code and the comp plan, but I felt like you all really knew those as if, I don't know, like almost you memorized them to an extent or just had a lot of experience with them. But I just really appreciate that level of commitment from you and the rest of the council. Thank you.
Okay, so ready for a vote? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, thank you. Thank you all very much. Do we need a break before the next one? Yeah, okay. All right, we got 2-1. Anybody need a break or shall we keep going? Keep going, all right. You may take a break if you need one. All right. Next up, under other ordinances, resolutions, and motions is, I think it's an ordinance that we're looking at. I don't have that.
Council members, it's proposed ordinance 6665, which establishes permitting requirements to remove landmark trees, provides for severability, establishes an effective date, and provides for sunsetting of this particular ordinance. And just by way of background, this topic was last discussed by council at your June 6th meeting, where council directed staff to draft an ordinance that establishes permitting requirements to remove landmark trees defined as a tree with a diameter at breast height of 24 inches or greater, with the intent that this interim regulations will sunset at the end of 2023 or when the permanent code is adopted, whichever is earlier. So joining us this evening for a brief staff report is Liz Stead, our interim co-director at the Development Services Department. She is joined by Mac McFarland, our attorney with the City Attorney's Office. With that, I'll turn it over to you two.
Thank you, City Manager, and good evening again, council members. I noticed that Councilmember Zahn did not take the paper copy. I presume you're saving some trees there as we move through this. So this evening we are back tonight, and I apologize that Christina Gallant was unable to attend this evening, but I've got Matt McFarland here to be my able assist, and we are looking for council direction as requested by council in the past to adopt an ordinance. You had provided us direction on June 7th, 2 weeks ago, to amend the Clear and Grade Code, which is Chapter 23.76 of the Bellevue City Code, to require a permit application and approval to remove any landmark trees. Tonight, we're going to go through and talk about some of the questions that council asked during our last encounter, and we also did bring back the tree ordinance for adoption. So some of the clarification that we heard requests regarding was about who can remove landmark trees, what is the potential height threshold. We also heard some requests for more public information, and also what data could be gathered through the permitting process. The first question that we wanted to address this evening is who can remove landmark trees? We have provided in the proposed ordinance that is in front of you a requirement that the applicant must provide a licensed contractor information prior to permit issuance, and landmark tree removal must be by a licensed contractor. That is something that we heard a request from the council in our previous interaction to look into, and we were able to add that to the ordinance. The next question was around a height threshold. Height thresholds are challenging. They're really not typical to most tree regulations, and it is very difficult to measure without special equipment. What is generally found in most tree regulations is a measurement of diameter at breast height, and that can be measured quite easily and accurately even by a homeowner. So that would be required that you would measure the tree around at 4.5 feet above grade. And you could use a standard, any sort of soft measuring tape, measure around the tree, divide by 3.14, and you'll have your diameter. So we will provide that in all of our public information for ease of use so that we don't have any confusion for our applicants as well. This does also provide an opportunity for us in the future to incorporate variations for specific species or other considerations in the future code updates. And we can also continue to pursue, are there any height, other height analysis that would make sense when we move into the permanent regulations, which we expect to be starting the work on that in the third quarter of this year. But as a placeholder, we could continue with the existing DBH, diameter at breast height, that we use in our other regulations. We also had a question about how the public information will be provided. We do have a section on the city internet page that is around tree removal and already provides some information, so we would actually add this into that section. We also will put something into our city newsletters and also on social media to let people know, hey, this is happening, regulations have changed, be aware, understand what those are. We will be doing a lot of internal training with our staff, and they are the ones that are answering the questions at the land use desk and providing that information back out. And we will also update all of our permitting and submittal requirements to make sure that it's clear what is necessary for a permit and when do you need to come in and when do you not. The other question that was brought up is what is the data that will be gathered? And I think this was really important because as we do move into permanent regulations, we can use this to help assist us understanding what the needs are as we move forward. So we will be able to gather data on the location and neighborhood of which trees are being removed so that we can determine if there's more removal in some neighborhoods than others. We'll also be able to determine the number and the size of the trees that are being removed. We will also be able to understand if there are critical areas on site, which also impacts your tree removal. And lastly, we will look at any clearing and grading activity to determine what trees are being removed. The tree ordinance, as proposed today, addresses the landmark trees and provides a definition with a diameter at breast height of 24 inches or greater. It does require a clearing grading permit to remove any of those landmark trees, and it is noted in the ordinance that it will sunset or be replaced with permanent code by December 31st of 2023. The next steps moving forward would be this evening, if you choose to take action on the proposed ordinance that we have provided, we would go ahead and implement that through staff training and public information. And then we would then move into, once we have that move forward, we'd continue work to initiate the tree regulation amendments, the more comprehensive package that we see coming to you for initiation probably in September is what we're thinking, depending on council's schedule and timing. So this evening, the action that we are requesting is that council adopt ordinance number 6665, and both Mr. McFarland and I are available for any further questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Deputy Mayor, would you like to make a motion?
Certainly, Mayor. I move to adopt ordinance 6665, establishing a permitting requirements to remove landmark trees.
Okay, any comments or questions? Councilmember Robertson, followed by Councilmember Zahn.
Thank you. I appreciate the explanation, and I appreciate your drawing my attention to the sunset section 4. I didn't notice that before. I'm supportive of this, but I think it could be a little clearer. The council had some comments last time about limiting the height. I would like to put in here the definition of a landmark tree defined as any tree with a diameter at breast height of 24 inches or greater, and which is 20 feet tall or taller. I just think that that will get away from people having to get a clear and grade permit to grind a stump. I mean, I don't know if that's the right height, but there's also some severely topped trees that are only 20 feet tall. I think this won't apply to a lot of trees that are 24 inches in diameter or greater, but the ones that it does apply to, I think should be allowed to be removed without going through permitting. That's number one. Number two, I understand about the diameter equals pi, times pi is the circumference, which is 75.4 inches. I'm wondering if it might be easier to actually put in the circumference in parentheses, and also to put in actual measurements from breast height. My good friend Google told me that breast height is average 4.3 feet. You said it's 4.5. Breast height for me is probably about 4. And for my nephew, who's 6'11", it's probably around 5.5 feet, So it might be nice to say when measured from if it's 4.5, 4.3, whatever the right number is, when measured from 4.5 feet above the ground. I just think that's, we talk about equity and inclusion here. This is one where it's like, who does this apply to? So I think having standard measurements, regardless of the height of the person taking them, would be really helpful. And I'm happy to make those motions if my colleagues support them. So those 3 things are under 20 feet tall, add the circumference, which is 75.4 inches for clarity for homeowners, and 3, add, instead of breast height, add when measured from, and I'm not sure, I'd defer to Liz, when measured from either whatever is 4.3, 4.5 feet above ground. I think that that would make it clearer, and I absolutely support doing this, so.
Just to clarify, I think you said in your definition of landmark trees, it was 20 feet or taller.
20 feet or short, or taller.
Yeah, okay.
So it doesn't apply to the 20, to under 20 feet. Sorry.
That's okay.
I'm kind of getting tired.
Councilmember Zahn.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree with my colleagues. That was what I was going to bring up, because last time I was saying, people are going to measure around their circumference. So the idea, you're going to take 24 times 3.14. I mean, let's simplify as much as possible. I mean, can we even round? So we're essentially saying circumference of 6 feet or more is considered a landmark tree, and 4 feet above ground, or if you want to make them the same, it's like 6 feet around and 6 feet above ground. Just to simplify as much as possible, because I do think if we're going to have people do math, it just creates a little more. Or I have to admit, I was going and looking for what DBH stood for myself for a while, trying to figure out, and then I'm like, oh, wait a minute. I thought the B stood for base, and then I read it and I thought, oh no, it stood for breast. Okay, so it did create some confusion. So if we could agree on just simplified measurements, I think it would be helpful. I like having some height that says, because I was actually thinking, well, what's the right height so that it wouldn't hit a house? So how tall is a house, and what's that right height if that's the goal of what we're trying to do with getting the permit? Because it goes then to my last question, which is when I think about the need to cut down a tree and the cost of the permit, I think last time you had given us a number of, wasn't it like $600 to get a permit? That seems like an awful lot of money to get a permit. I mean, I understand we want to collect data. We want to be thoughtful about making sure that they're using a licensed contractor, but I am concerned with the cost of food and everything else, that just seems like a really high number. So whether there's anything we can do about the cost of getting the permit, because I think the goal is not to collect money from people so much as making sure we don't have folks that are cutting down trees that aren't licensed. So one, can you remind me of the dollars for the permit? And then two, whether there's anything we could do about the cost.
Well, and also explain what the cost is for.
I can go ahead and take that. The current cost is consistent with regulations in bridle trails to remove trees as well, so it was pegged to the same benchmark. It is $464 for 2 or less trees, and 3 or more trees would be $857. The cost involved in that is to bring the permit in, review the permit, and also provide inspections once the work is being done. So development services is a cost recovery operation. We do have a lot of costs associated with staffing and with all the systems that we have. So that is the number that has been determined over time to be the amount of time that it requires us to do this body of work for these permits.
Okay, because I was just thinking, here, what we really want is for people to actually get a permit and to get a licensed contractor. And if they shy away because of the cost, I'm just concerned about it. I understand the process and how we think about cost recovery. I just wonder if there's some ways to reduce the cost or subsidize in some way so that we actually are incenting people to do the right thing and get the permit and use a licensed contractor. Thanks.
Okay, Councilmember Barksdale.
All right, thank you. I agree with what's been said in terms of clarifying the code, simplifying it, and setting a height. I mentioned that during the last time this was discussed at council, that having a height would help. So there we go. I think in terms of what that height should be, it's just whatever achieves the goal. So it sounds like similar to what Councilmember Zahn said, to prevent injury or damage. I don't know if that is, maybe we clarify, but I do support it.
And I'll just say I concur with defining what a landmark tree is by the diameter of 24 inches or greater and a height, if we can legally do that. And I like the 20-foot or whatever, but, you know. And I appreciate specifying what height you measure the circumference at for the public, and also converting the diameter to a circumference, just to make it easy. But I know you have to legally put consistent language in the code or in the permit requirements, so just in parens to maybe clarify for the public what you mean by that would be helpful. Any other comments? Yes, Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, I'm supportive of this, and thanks for the great presentation and for taking all of our feedback last time. This was before the council. Just a couple of quick questions. Before that, I agree with the mayor and Councilmember Robertson in terms of the height and just making this as easy as possible for everyone to understand what the requirements are. So, you know, we're not getting into arguments between residents and code compliance, and I thought you meant this and the other. So, so that would be really great. I shared Councilmember Zon's concern. I come at it from a slightly different perspective, but if a homeowner discovers that their tree is diseased or a beetle infestation or something like that, and he or she wants to do the right thing and have it removed, I'm assuming they would still, even if it was diseased, and it could be an immediate danger to their neighborhood, they would still need to get a permit. That would be correct, right? Okay, so, you know, it would be great if we followed what utilities does in terms of any hardship cases and they cannot afford for that permit, that we provide some type of subsidy or partial subsidy so that they can still address that issue. Because I know one of the reasons that Mayor Robinson brought this forward was from a safety perspective. So we certainly want to encourage people to certainly do the right thing. And if a tree does need to come down for safety reasons, they take that action. So would love to see that included. And then just from the engagement or outreach standpoint, because I know we always put up a web page. I'd like to see us maybe do something, and not just with this, but with other topics as well, but just a little bit more aggressive in terms of the outreach to notify folks about this. You know, maybe it's a bill insert when people get their utilities bill, because everybody gets one in the city. So that's one way to make sure that everybody in the city understands this is a new ordinance coming their way, and what the requirements are. Thank you.
And I'll just do an addendum to my comments. I forgot one. If we could look at the My Bellevue app and maybe put a section in there on trees. I think that doesn't have to go with tonight's vote, but I'd be interested in looking at that. And I think I emailed you, Liz, and with some suggestions what to include in that. Councilmember Lee.
Thank you. I don't want to repeat to everything, but I do support Deputy Mayor and also the Mayor's emphasis on the safety aspect of it. So that's a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to make sure that, so if a tree is 4.5 in circumference and over 20 feet, it's a landmark tree. We need to make, that's to make sure everybody understands that. And I think it's a great step forward and rational rule at this point. And we should do it. And include, I agree with the Deputy Mayor's comments about, you know, in hardships situations. And I think as we go further down the line, looking at this in terms of overall impact and our goals and everything else, maybe we take a look at, you know, the cost and everything else. But at this point, that would not be appropriate to do that.
Okay, Councilmember Robertson. Oh, sorry. Let's let Deputy Mayor amend what he said.
Sorry, I just wanted to mention that yeah, it would be great if we can include that in the data analysis that that we'll be tracking how many hardship cases there were. Thank you.
Go ahead, Councilmember Robertson.
And then I was going to make a motion to amend, listening to the conversation about the language, so that we can pass it tonight. So on the, if someone has an emergency where they have a tree that it's half blown over by a windstorm, all of a sudden it's diseased and the limbs are falling off. don't we usually have an exception in codes that would allow someone to do the work to make it safe and then come get a permit afterwards? Would that apply here?
We have had that in the past, and generally what has happened when people have called us and said, hey, we've got a tree that is in danger, we believe it may fall over, we've actually tried to provide someone from staff to review it immediately and get through that. So it's more been a process versus a code.
Okay, got it. So listening to the language and looking at the ordinance in front of us, I would move to amend the ordinance to change, I think it's just the first sentence, to read as follows. Removal of any landmark tree, comma, defined as any tree 20 feet or more in height with a diameter of 24 inches or greater, parentheses, or a circumference of over 75 inches, close parentheses, when measured from 4.5 feet above ground, comma, shall be, and then it picks up there, subject to the permit requirements and the same provisions applicable to projects listed in BCC 2376035A. So that would change that first sentence, and I'm happy to reread it.
No, I think they got that.
Okay, I need a second.
I just want to make sure that legally, I mean, you can write it with explanation. I think legally you may have to include the wording as it is typically said, but with maybe that explanation, which I think we'd all be okay with.
Yeah, I'm not following there.
Well, if they give the diameter and the circumference.
Yeah, and I rounded the circumference down.
Yeah.
If it's really close, then I guess, I don't know.
The requirement with measuring from 4 feet is consistent with our pre-existing code language that we already have.
4 feet or 4.5 feet?
I'd have to go back and look. It's either 4 or 4.5 from
Whatever we
grade.
do is what I'm trying to.
Right, right. And that goes to any of the significant trees which we already regulate and certain land use districts are in connection with plats. And our definition for significant trees does talk about measuring from grade. I believe this is what Councilmember Robertson is talking about. And it does talk about the diameter in that case, which is 8 inches, but we're talking about 24 here or greater. I also would point out that our land use code at that same section in 2020-900, it does talk about height. It talks about prioritizing significant trees that are 60 feet or taller for retention. So I think the height language is not a problem either.
Okay.
The only new standard that we have and what's being proposed is the circumference language. That's not, it just doesn't track the way that we've done it in the past with the significant trees. But if conceptually the full council is looking for each of those 3 items, then I can certainly work on the language to capture all 3 of those.
Great.
Is that the direction we're giving?
That's the direction, that's the amended direction.
We got to vote on it first. Right?
We do have to vote on it first, I'm just clarifying. All right, let's.
Before we vote, can I just ask Matt one more thing?
Mm-hmm.
So or ask the council one more thing. I guess my request is that you take the amendment and write it how you see, how you see fit, but with those 3 things. If I don't have the numbers quite right, fix it, please. If the council's okay with that approach. I don't want to be prescriptive here. We just want to be clear for the homeowners.
I think our direction is clear. So we're going to vote on the amendment that you made. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And then we're going to vote on the ordinance.
Excuse me, Mayor.
What?
The city attorney wanted to weigh in.
Well, I'm just trying to be clear about process here, because what I think I'm hearing is that there's some potential for some flexibility in the actual language that the council would adopt. So I'm not sure if you can adopt it tonight if you don't have the actual language of the ordinance, and this is a regulatory, as you know, ordinance, so precision in the language.
Well, we're asking them to true it up, but we don't know exactly what number to give them.
Back on consent calendar, and that it would not be adopted tonight.
Okay.
But
wanna
based
get
on
this
what
done.
Ms. Gerla said too, which is a very good point, this is regulatory, it's regulating private property. So we need to make sure that we bring it back with the language and then council approves it, but that can be done on consent calendar.
I'd like to get this done tonight if at all possible. Is there any possibility of?
We take a break, how long, and not to put
Well,
you under pressure?
Well, one concern that I have also is if we're talking about hardship cases or safety kind of exceptions, that's a new issue
We're not.
also.
That's not in the motion.
Okay,
It's not in the motion.
It's just, yeah,
okay.
it's just to add those three things. 20 feet, measure where the breast height is, and adding the circumference.
We take a quick break and we'll try to
Okay.
shore up the
We will
language.
take a break till 20 after. Thank you. In order. Back in business. So, do you have a recommendation on how we might word this amendment? You can tell Councilmember Robertson, and she will then say it back to us.
I do. Thank you for the 6 minutes. That was very productive. Removal of any landmark tree, comma, defined as any tree with, or any tree 20 feet or more in height with a diameter at breast height of 24 inches or greater, parentheses, measured 4 feet above existing grade, in parentheses, or a circumference of more than 75 inches, shall be subject to the permit requirements and the same provisions applicable to projects listed in the city's clearing and grading code.
Is that your motion?
That is my motion.
Okay.
And is the seconder still seconding?
Okay. All right. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And then that's a motion for the amendment, and then we will vote on the, I think we have a motion on the floor.
We do.
Am I right?
You do.
Okay, so let's, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, we did it. Thank you.
Can I make a quick comment?
Yes, and then you got to remind me that I have to say something before we adjourn.
Mayor, thank you for bringing this forward. This was all you, and we've been talking about tree codes, and you got this done. And thank you, staff, for moving so fast on it and being so clever in your 1/10 of an hour that you had in between our breaks. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay, we are going to conclude the public portion of tonight's meeting. The council will now recess to executive session for approximately 30 minutes pursuant to RCW 4230-110-1I. The meeting will be adjourned from the executive session. Thank you.